On the morning of the 22nd of February, 1943, the road west out of the Kasserine Pass was a museum of everything an army leaves behind when it runs. Burned half-tracks sat nose down in the ditches. Field guns stood abandoned, still hitched to trucks that would never move again. Bedrolls, ration tins, a helmet, a typewriter lying open in the sand where some clerk had dropped it and kept going. In 6 days of fighting, the United States Army in Tunisia had lost more than 6,000 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and close to 200 tanks, and something harder to count than either. The Germans who watched it happen drew a conclusion from what they saw, and the conclusion was simple. The American had the factories. He did not have the stomach for this, and he never would. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. That verdict is where this story begins, because a verdict is not a fact. It is a prediction, and 1 month later, on a low brown ridge outside a dusty town called El Getter, the men who had been written off were going to answer it. Not with a speech, with artillery and anti-tank guns, and a flat refusal to break that the German command had already decided was not in them. This is the story of the 30 days between the running and the answer. It is the story of the worst defeat American arms suffered in the war against Germany, of the general who was sent into the wreckage to fix it, and of the morning the whole equation turned over while the man who had written the verdict was no longer even on the continent to see it proved wrong. To understand the contempt, you have to understand how little the Americans had earned the benefit of the doubt. When the United States came ashore in North Africa on the 8th of November, 1942, in Operation Torch, it came in enormous numbers and with almost no experience. More than 100,000 American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria against the soldiers of Vichy France, men who were fighting for a defeated government with no real heart for the killing and who surrendered in large numbers within days. American commanders looked at that and called it combat. They wrote reports describing it as seasoning, as valuable experience under fire. It was neither. It was a rehearsal performed against an opponent who was barely willing to be on the stage. The real examination was still in front of them, sitting in the mountains of Tunisia, and it would be graded by the most experienced army on earth. The man holding the pencil on the American side of that examination was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the United States Second Corps. Fredendall was the kind of officer who showed well in a briefing room. He spoke with confidence. He had maps and a manner and an answer for everything. What he did not have was any feel for the ground his men were actually standing on. He placed his corps headquarters in a ravine far behind the front, near Tebessa, and set his engineers to blasting an elaborate underground bunker out of solid rock, tunneling for weeks while the rifle companies at the front went short of mines and wire and ammunition. He rarely visited those forward positions. He commanded by telephone and by a private slang of his own invention, referring to units and places in a homemade code so clumsy that his subordinates sometimes spent an hour decoding an order that the situation had already overtaken. He scattered his armor in small packets across the hills, parceled out his tanks without infantry to protect them, a violation of basic doctrine so plain that any German panzer officer would have called it suicide on sight. He did not know with any precision where his own units were. He knew even less about the enemy. The enemy knew exactly where he was. On the 14th of February, the Germans struck at Sidi Bou Zid, driving armored columns through the Fade Pass into the heart of the American positions. The 1st Armored Division was cut to pieces in detail, its tanks committed piecemeal into prepared anti-tank fire and destroyed in ones and twos and dozens. Combat commands were ordered to counterattack in a ground nobody had scouted, and they drove straight into ambush. Within 48 hours, the front the Americans had been told to hold simply ceased to exist. Units were overrun before they understood the line had moved. A command post was abandoned with its radio still transmitting. Staff officers loaded into trucks and drove west. And the men in the rifle pits, the ones who had no idea that the larger picture had already collapsed around them, did what frightened and badly led men do. Some of them fought hard in small pockets and died in place. Many of them got up and ran, dropping rifles and packs, and anything that slowed them, sprinting across open desert under the scream of German 88s, part of a route that swept back through the passes and turned the Kasserine into a corridor of retreat. By the time it ended, Rommel's spearheads had punched deep enough that they had overrun supply dumps, and the Allied command had genuinely feared for the whole position in Tunisia. The Germans were stopped not by a heroic stand, but by a combination of things. Their own supplies were thin. There was friction at the top of the German command between Rommel and General von Arnim, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army and who did not love taking direction from the Desert Fox. The terrain ahead funneled and slowed the attackers. And the Allies, with their bottomless reserves, poured in artillery and reinforcements faster than the Germans could exploit. Rommel, weighing the cost against the prize, chose not to drive deeper. He turned his attention back toward the British in the south, and the Kasserine fighting guttered out. But the verdict it produced outlived the battle. Here it is worth being careful, because the truth is more interesting than the legend. Rommel himself, in the assessments later gathered and published as the Rommel Papers, was not actually the sneering caricature that the title of a story like this might suggest. He noted the inexperience of the Americans, certainly, but he was struck, even alarmed, by something the contempt of other German officers missed entirely. He saw how much material the Americans had, more of everything than any army he had ever faced, and he saw how fast they learned. He recorded that the Americans absorbed the lessons of their defeats with a speed that the more rigid armies of Europe could not match, and that this, more than their courage or their lack of it, was what would eventually make them dangerous. That was the prescient view, and it belonged to the one German commander good enough to hold it. The prevailing view in the German command was simpler and more comfortable. The American soldier was soft. He was a civilian in a uniform, raised in comfort, undisciplined, more interested in his rations and his trucks than in the cold business of killing and dying. He would not stand. He would not press home. Whatever he had between him and his factories, it was not the thing that makes a soldier hold a position when the position is being overrun. That was the verdict. It was written into intelligence summaries and repeated in officers' messes and built quietly into German planning. The assumption that when the Americans were pushed hard, they would come apart the way they had come apart at Kasserine. It was the kind of judgment that feels like wisdom and functions like a trap, because an enemy who is sure you cannot fight will, sooner or later, give you the chance to prove him wrong. The Americans understood the verdict too, and it humiliated them. And in the army, that humiliation rolled uphill until it reached the desk of the man commanding the entire Allied effort, General Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had watched a corps of his own army break, and he understood that the problem was not, at bottom, the courage of the men in the rifle pits. The problem was that they had been led by a man who commanded from a tunnel and who had never built in them the habits that hold an outfit together when everything is going wrong. He relieved Fredendall. He did it about as gently as such things are done, sending him home to a training command in the United States, where Fredendall would be promoted and given charge of preparing other men for a war he had been removed from the front of. And in his place, to take command of the Second Corps and put it back together, Eisenhower sent for George Patton. Patton arrived on the 6th of March, 1943, and he arrived the way he did everything, at full volume. Sirens, outriders, a column of vehicles with flags flying and stars on everything. He was 57 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for precisely this, for the chance to command a large force of Americans in a great war, and he had begun to fear the war would end before he got it. He was, by any honest reckoning, a deeply strange and difficult man. He was profane to a degree that shocked even soldiers. He was a self-mythologizer who believed he had lived before his soldiers in older armies. His judgment away from the battlefield could be catastrophic, and within months on Sicily, he would strike 2 hospitalized soldiers for what he took to be cowardice and very nearly end his own career over it. He was not a saint, and the men who knew him best did not pretend he was. But he understood one thing about beaten soldiers that Fredendall had never grasped, and it was the thing the Second Corps needed. He understood that discipline and courage are the same muscle. Within 90 minutes of reaching the Corps headquarters, he had relieved officers. By the next morning, he had issued orders that struck many of his men as absurd, even cruel. Every soldier in the Second Corps would wear his helmet at all times. He would wear his necktie. He would wear his leggings, shave every day, and be properly dressed whether he was in the line or in the rear or eating his food. There would be fines for violations enforced down to the lowest private and up through the officer corps without exception. The men were baffled, and many of them were furious. They were being asked to knot a necktie in a desert where men had recently been dying in the open, and it seemed like the pettiest kind of parade ground nonsense from a general who had not been there when the line broke. It was not nonsense. Patton was doing something deliberate and precise. He had taken command of an outfit that had learned, at Kasserine, that orders could be ignored, that the line could be left, that running was survivable. He intended to teach them, in 1,000 small and uncomfortable ways, the opposite lesson before the shooting started again. The point was not the necktie. The point was the habit. A man who knots his tie because he was told to, when it is hot and pointless and he resents it, is building the reflex of doing the correct thing under pressure when every instinct in his body is screaming at him to do something else. That reflex is what keeps a gun crew on its gun when the tanks are coming. Patton was not preparing his men to look like soldiers. He was rebuilding the machinery that makes a soldier stay. He drove the Corps hard for 2 weeks, and he did it in person, appearing at the front, at the gun positions, in the dust, the opposite of the man he had replaced. And in his private diary, he confessed the thing he wanted most, which was to face Rommel himself, to take the measure of the desert fox on the field and beat him. It is one of the quiet ironies of this whole story that he would not get the chance. Rommel, exhausted and sick, his health broken by the campaign, left North Africa on the 9th of March, 1943, 3 days after Patton arrived, and he never came back. The two men, whose names would be welded together in the popular memory of the war, commanded in the same theater for 72 hours and never once met. The verdict about the American soldier was Rommel's army's verdict. The answer to it would be delivered to the men he left behind. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The answer would be delivered at a place called El Getter. In the middle of March, Patton's Corps was given a job. It was in a larger Allied design, partly a job and partly a test. Montgomery's 8th Army was driving up from the south against the Axis line, and the Americans were to push from the west, threatening the German and Italian flank and pinning forces that might otherwise reinforce against the British. On the 17th of March, the 1st Infantry Division took the town of Gafsa. This was the Big Red One, commanded by Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, a hard, unconventional, hard-drinking officer whom Patton both valued and distrusted, with the young Theodore Roosevelt Jr. as his assistant commander, a man who walked the line with a cane and a pistol and seemed not to know how to be afraid. The division pushed on past Gafsa, southeast toward the town of El Getter and the road that ran from there down to the coast at Gabes, and there it dug in among the bare hills that flanked the valley. And on the German side, a decision was taken that grew directly out of the verdict. The Germans needed to deal with the American push, and they did not regard it as a serious problem. These were the men of Kasserine. They had run once, and they would run again. The instrument chosen for the job was the 10th Panzer Division, the same kind of formation, in some cases the very same division, that had broken the Americans a month before. Veteran crews, real tanks, men who had been making war since before most of the Americans in front of them had ever held a rifle. The plan was straightforward and grounded in everything the German command believed to be true. They would attack down the El Getter Valley into the dug-in American infantry, and they would do to the 1st Division what had been done at Kasserine. They would hit hard and fast, and the Americans would come apart, and the western flank would be cleared. It was a sound plan built on a single assumption, and the assumption was the verdict. The American will not stand. What the Germans did not know, driving forward in the dark, was that the men in those hills were no longer entirely the men who had run. They had a new commander who had spent 2 weeks rebuilding the reflex to stay. They had artillery massed and registered, gun crews who had been drilled past the point of thinking. They had tank destroyers tucked into the folds of the ground along the valley, and they had infantry on the high shoulders looking down into the killing space where the German armor would have to come. And they had something the German verdict had not accounted for, which was a specific, burning memory of having been called cowards by the men they were now waiting for in the dark. On the night of the 22nd of March, the listening posts forward of the American line began to hear it. The unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles in the distance, engines and the squeal of metal, moving up in the darkness toward the mouth of the valley. The word went back. Up in the hills, men checked their weapons in the cold and watched the eastern sky. The gunners stood by their pieces. Down in the valley, the tank destroyer crews waited in the folds of the ground with their fingers near the lanyards, listening to the engines grow, knowing what was coming up the road in the gray hour before dawn. The verdict had been written a month before in the wreckage on the Kasserine Road. In a few hours, on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1943, it was going to be answered. And the answer was going to be the kind that does not need words. It came a little after 6 o'clock in the morning, out of the east with the sun behind it. That was the first advantage the Germans had given themselves, and it was a real one. The tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled down the El Gitter Valley with the low sun at their backs, so that the American gunners on the high ground were looking into the glare, trying to pick dark shapes out of a brightness that hurt the eyes. The shapes were there, panzers in line, with armored cars and half-tracks among them, and infantry coming up behind, moving down the broad floor of the valley toward the hills where the 1st Infantry Division had spent 2 days digging in. The men in the forward positions heard them before they saw them clearly, the grinding of tracks and the flat sound of engines under load, and the word went back along the line and up to the gun positions, and the order was the same everywhere. Hold! Let them come. This was the moment the verdict had predicted. American infantry dug in, with German armor rolling straight at them in the first gray light. A month before at Kasserine, men in this same situation had gotten up and run. The German plan assumed they would do it again. The whole attack was built on it, the speed and the directness of it, the confidence that one hard shove would crack the line open and turn the defense into a route that could be chased all the way back to Gafsa. The line did not crack. Some of the forward positions were overrun in the first hour. That is the part the legend leaves out, and it matters because what the 1st Division did that morning was not painless, and it was not clean. German tanks pushed into the American outposts, and some of the men in those outposts were killed at their guns, and some were captured. And there were minutes along that front when the thing hung in the balance exactly the way the Germans had expected it to. But the men who were pushed back did not keep going. They fell back to the next position, and they stayed there. And while they held, the ground itself began to do its work. American engineers had been busy in the dark. Across the floor of the valley, in the obvious lanes where armor would have to move, they had laid minefields, and the German tanks driving down into the valley began to find them. A track would catch a mine, and the tank would slew and stop, throwing a track, sitting dead in the open. The neat lines of the advance bunched and slowed as drivers tried to thread between the explosions, and the bunching pushed the armor into exactly the ground the Americans wanted it in, channeled and crowded and slow, in the open, onto the hills. And then the artillery opened up. This is the heart of it, and it is worth slowing down for, because the thing that broke the 10th Panzer Division at El Gitter was not a charge or a hero or a clever maneuver. It was American gunnery, and American gunnery in 1943 was very, very good. The United States Army had built, almost quietly, the best field artillery system in the world, organized around fire direction centers that could take a single observer's call and bring the guns of many battalions down onto one piece of ground at one moment. The men in the hills above the valley had observers forward, and the observers had the German armor laid out below them in the glare, stalled and bunched in the minefields, and they called the fire down. Battalion after battalion fired on the same coordinates. The shells arrived together. The valley floor where the panzers were crowded came apart in a single rolling concussion of high explosive, and then another, walking back and forth across the German formation as the observers adjusted and called again. Into that, the American tank destroyers went down to meet the tanks directly. The tank destroyer battalions, the 601st Chief among them, drove their self-propelled guns down off the shoulders of the valley and into the fight at close range, many of them little more than field pieces bolted on a thin-skinned half-tracks. No armor to speak of, going gun to gun against panzers that could kill them with a single hit. They were savaged. The 601st lost most of its vehicles in that morning's fighting, burning along the valley floor, and the men in them paid the full price for the doctrine that had sent them out to trade shots with tanks. But before they died, they knocked out German armor, and together with the mines and the mass guns above them, they turned the valley into a place no formation could survive in for long. By the middle of the morning, the German attack was finished. It had not broken through. It had not even come close in the end. The 10th Panzer Division pulled back down the valley the way it had come, leaving behind it something on the order of 30 tanks, by most accounts, burning or broken in the minefields and the artillery-beaten zone, along with the half-tracks and the dead. The men in the American hills watched them go. Many of those men had been at Kasserine. They had been told by the army, now retreating in front of them, that they would run. They had not run. They had stood on the high ground and broken a panzer division, and they had watched it withdraw. The Germans were not done. In the late afternoon, just before 5 o'clock, they came again. This time they led with infantry, the Panzer Grenadiers of the 10th Panzer moving forward under what armor was left, trying to do with men what the tanks had failed to do in the morning. And the same thing happened to them. The American observers were still in the hills. The guns were still laid. The afternoon attack moved up into the same killing ground, and the massed artillery found it again and broke it again, and by evening the second attack had failed as completely as the first. The 10th Panzer Division had spent itself twice against the 1st Infantry Division in a single day and had taken nothing. That was the answer. It is worth being honest about what it was and what it was not, because the channel does not sell easy endings, and this story does not need one. El Gitter did not win the war, or the campaign, or even the local fight in any tidy way. In the days after the 23rd of March, when the Americans tried to push the other direction, down the Gabes Road into the German positions, they found the going slow and bloody, and the breakthrough they wanted did not come. The follow-on fighting was a grind. The tank destroyer doctrine that had cost the 601st so dearly was shown to be flawed, and the argument over it would run for the rest of the war. None of that was glory, but the morning of the 23rd of March, 1943, was something the United States Army had not had before. It was the first time American troops had stood in front of a German armored attack and beaten it. Not survived it, beaten it. The men who had been written off after Kasserine had been handed the exact situation that had broken them. The same kind of enemy, the same kind of attack, and they had held the line and shattered the formation that came at them. The verdict said the American would not stand. At El Gitter he stood, and the proof was a valley full of burning panzers and a line that never gave way. And here is the irony that sits at the center of this whole story, the thing that the dramatic version of it almost always gets wrong. The reply was not a sentence. There's a famous line, the one most people half remember, where Patton stands on a hill watching the German tanks burn and says, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." It is a wonderful line. It is also a complete invention, written for a film decades later. Patton never said it, and he could not have said it to Rommel even in spirit because Rommel was not there. Rommel had left Africa 2 weeks before, sick and worn down, and he never came back. The man whose army had pronounced the verdict on the American soldier was lying in a bed in Europe while the verdict was being disproved in the Tunisian sun, and he would read about it, if he read about it at all, in a report. So the reply Patton gave to the men who said Americans lacked the courage to fight was not something he said. It was something his corps did on a brown ridge above a road to the sea, on a March morning, while the author of the insult was already gone from the field. The most brutal thing you can do to a man who is certain you cannot fight is to fight, and win, and make him watch the bill come due from a distance, in numbers, in a column of casualty figures and lost tanks that no contempt can argue with. That is what El Gitter was. It was the answer that did not need words, delivered to an enemy who was no longer there to hear them. Patton himself stayed forward through the days that followed, in the dust and the danger, the opposite of the man he had replaced, and the cost of being forward found him in a way the after-action reports record plainly. On the 1st of April, 1945, German aircraft caught the area near his command, and the bombs killed his young aide, Captain Richard Jensen, a man Patton had been fond of, almost a son to him. Patton went to where Jensen had been killed, and the grief and the rage went into his diary and into a fury at the lack of Allied air cover that would sour his relations with the British airmen for weeks. It is a small detail in a large campaign. It belongs in the story because it is the kind of thing the Burning Valley does not show you. The men who broke the 10th Panzer Division were not figures in a triumph. They were tired, frightened, ordinary men, and the price of standing was paid in people like Jensen, killed in the open by a plane, on a day that had nothing in it of glory. The campaign moved on past get-her-the-way campaigns do, larger than any one fight. The Americans ground forward in the south while the British drove up from below, and the whole Axis position in Tunisia began, slowly and then quickly, to fold. In the middle of April, Patton handed the Second Corps over to his subordinate, Omar Bradley, and went back to begin planning the invasion of Sicily, which was the next thing, the bigger thing. He had taken a beaten corps, and in a matter of weeks had made it into an outfit that could stand against the best the Germans had. And then he had been pulled away from it before the end, which is how it usually goes for the men who do that kind of work. The end came in May. On the 7th of May, 1943, Tunis and Bizerta fell. The Axis forces in Tunisia, cut off and out of room, surrendered in the following days, and the final capitulation around the 13th of May put something close to 250,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied prisoner cages, one of the largest single surrenders of the entire war. General von Arnim, who had commanded the German army there and who had not loved taking orders from Rommel, went into captivity with them. The army that had run laughing across the Kasserine in February had, by May, helped take the surrender of the men who laughed. And the men of the story scattered into the rest of the war, into the fates the rest of the war handed out. Rommel went on. He commanded briefly in Italy and then in France, building the coastal defenses that the Allies would have to break on the 6th of June, 1944. He had been right about the Americans in the one way that mattered, that they learned fast and had everything, and he never lost that clear sight even as the men around Hitler refused to. In the summer of 1944, he was drawn into the edges of the plot against Hitler, and on the 14th of October, 1944, two generals came to his house and gave him the choice the regime gave its own when it wished to destroy them quietly: a public trial and the ruin of his family, or poison and a state funeral with a cover story. He took the poison. The man whose army had decided the American soldier was soft-died by his own hand on the orders of the leader he had served, and was buried under a lie, while the soldiers he had underestimated were driving toward the heart of his country. Terry Allen and Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., who had commanded the 1st Division that held the line at El Getter, were both relieved of that division after Sicily, in part over the very looseness and independence that had also made the Big Red One so good. It was a hard end to a great command. Roosevelt was not finished. On the 6th of June, 1944, he went ashore at Utah Beach in the first wave, the oldest man on the beach and the only general in the first wave, walking the sand with his cane and his pistol and steadying the men around him. And for it he was given the Medal of Honor. He did not live to receive it. He died of a heart attack in Normandy a few weeks later, in July of 1944, having survived the beach and the breakout to be killed by his own worn-out heart. Allen went on to raise and command another division and to fight it across Europe to the end. Patton went on to Sicily, where his own worst instincts nearly destroyed him when he struck two hospitalized soldiers he took for cowards, an act that says as much about the man as the brilliance does, and that nearly ended the career of the general who had rebuilt the Second Corps. He survived the scandal, barely, and went on to command the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy and the drive across France and the relief of the Bulge, the campaigns that made his name permanent. He outlived the war in Europe by months. He died in December of 1945 after a car accident. In the country he had helped defeat, the great battlefield commander of the American army killed not in battle but on a road. Go back at the end to the Kasserine Road in February to the burned half-tracks and the abandoned guns and the typewriter lying open in the sand. That was the evidence on which the verdict was written. The American had the factories and not the stomach. He would never be a soldier. It was a reasonable thing to conclude from what was lying on that road. And it was wrong. And the proof that it was wrong came 1 month later and 40 miles away on the high ground above El Getter, where the same men, under a new commander who had taught them to stay, took everything a panzer division could throw at them and broke it. The thing that turns a beaten army into one that wins is rarely a speech and almost never a single line delivered to an enemy's face. It is duller and harder than that. It is 2 weeks of neckties and shaving and fines, building the habit of doing the correct thing when every nerve says run. It is engineers laying mines in the dark. It is gun crews staying on their guns. It is observers in the hills calling the fire down, and tank destroyer men driving into a fight they could not win to buy the time the guns needed, and infantry falling back one position and then refusing to fall back again. The German command had a verdict about whether American soldiers had the courage to fight. The American soldier answered it at El Getter, in the only language the question really understands, and the man who had asked it was already gone, lying in a bed across the sea, reading the bill in a report. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.